May 16th is observed as International Day of the Boy Child. Now, this day is meant to focus on boys and their well-being and value within their families and the community. It partly stems from a belief that by neglecting the boy child, society plays a role in developing young men who are misguided and confused and often turn to crime. Now, to help us unpack this a little bit more, we're joined by Dr. Linda Ncube-Nkomo, who is the Chief Executive Officer at the new LoveLife Trust. Doctor, thanks so much for your time and welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning to you, good morning to your listeners, and thank you for the invitation to have this conversation.
A very important conversation, because if we look around, if we look at the scourge of gender-based violence, if we look at the crime situation, generally speaking, in our society, if we look at drug abuse as an example, we know that at the forefront of perpetrating a lot of these crimes are men and young men a lot of the time. So there's definitely a crisis that we are aware of, that we see and live through. But let's talk about that a little bit more in terms of the importance of a program such as this when we are dealing with what seems to be angry young men in our society.
And the programs around the recognition of the boys are aimed at addressing exactly those issues that you've just raised. So in addition to boys and young men being perpetrators of crime, there's an important narrative that needs to come in. And it's the narrative of the extent to which they themselves are victims of the same crimes. So if we were to start to looking more closely at what is driving these behaviors and wanting to get to the root of it, the fruit of that would most likely us seeing less homicides among men and women, less crimes of violence, and everything else that we're currently seeing that has caused a pandemic of violence in society, especially South African society.
So just looking at how we have approached some of these problems, a lot of the time there seems to be more emphasis, for obvious reasons, on the development of girl children in our society. But let's look at the challenges that this creates.
And you're right when you say we cannot negate the importance of focusing on girls. But if you look at all the things that we want to achieve with girls, we've got to remember that they live in a society alongside boys and men. And I often say the boy child is the most oppressed, depressed, and suppressed person in society. And when we continue to neglect the boys instead of developing him, especially in terms of his emotional intelligence, we do run the risk of leaving him behind and continuing to create a culture of a suppressed, oppressed, depressed, and ultimately very angry man in the end. So it is important that we start to look at how do we raise these boys differently? How do we start to break away the norms that they've associated with being a man, which in most instances are linked to violence, violence against other boys, violence against women, and in a lot of instances, again, you see that the victims of suicide, the highest numbers are among boys and men. So we really need to look at what do we need to do differently? How does policy need to change for us to recognize boys and young men as vulnerable and needing to have attention paid to them long before they become perpetrators of violence?
So let's talk about this, because young black men especially seemingly continue to be persecuted. They seemingly continue to be dehumanized around each and every corner that you can turn. So how do we deal with that in a significant way in order to make a difference?
We need to adopt the same approach that we have been adopting towards girl children, where we're saying at a personal level, what are we doing to them, for them? At a community and family level, what is being done, and then at a policy level, what is being done. I think if we can start looking at why the International Day of the Boy Child was founded in the first place by Dr. Jerome, it was really around what are the things that we need to do differently to celebrate and to nurture and to protect this generation of boys and the future. So if we can start looking at in the homes, what needs to change for us to raise a different generation of boys? And then what needs to change in society? What needs to change from a policy framework for us to start, like I said earlier on, recognizing them that they are as vulnerable, if not more vulnerable, to being victims of violence and homicide than the rest of the population, and starting to address those roots rather than going into an uproar when a vicious crime has been committed, because we're continuing on the road of raising boys and young men who are capable of heinous crimes. And it's the roots that we need to destroy and amplify the destruction of that root more than anything else.
That's such a critical point there. So let's just try and peel back a few more of the layers, because when we talk about raising boy children differently, part of the problem in our societal makeup is, of course, quite apart from the psychosocial, the socio-economic realities that are very well documented, you have a situation whereby most fathers are absent in the home. So young men are being raised by women. And this is the reality for many, especially black young men. So how does that situation contribute to the problems that we are dealing with?
I don't know that we've got enough research that says it's because the fathers are absent that boys are turning out violent. I think the deeper conversation that we need to look at is, in that absent father household, how is that boy being raised? How is he being affirmed? How is he being nurtured for him to not feel the absence of that father? What role are the uncles playing? What role are the neighbors playing? You know, the Deputy Minister of Social Development, Ume Henrietta Bukhopanezulu, has been misquoted when she says what I'm about to say. If I'm raising a child without a father in the home, how am I, as the mother, making sure that I never ever tell my son how useless he is because his father abandoned him? I never tell my son how I don't take out my anger on my son. And I think that's where this the narrative around what happens in the home needs to be expanded, because there are boys who are raised in homes where fathers are there. But those fathers are perpetrators of such violence. They are so oppressive, they are so angry that boys start to normalize that as being part of a loving relationship. So we need to also talk about the role of fathers who are in the lives of those boys, but the damage that they cause to them is more than what would be happening if they were not in those homes at all.
And that's a fair point. I absolutely take that. Different point, though. In the absence of those fathers, if the same-sex parent is the most important, the most influential role model in a child's life during their adolescent years, what does the absence of that particular parent mean when a child is being raised by a single parent? Does that render that specific child, a more gullible to outside influences and negative influences, for that matter, than a child who perhaps, as you rightly point out, could still be learning some of these negative traits in the household where a father is present? But in the absence of that father figure, what does that render that child to in society?
In the absence of a father figure, and there's been generations of boys and men raised without fathers, I think the question then should be, what now? There isn't a father, that's the reality of this household. What should I, as a single mother, be looking out for? And I think it would be very rare that in an entire street, there are no men who could play that role of a father. Within the society that the child is being raised, within the community, within the schools, it puts a burden and pressure, but necessary burden and pressure on the mother to then to start identifying positive role models that she could bring into that family space to be able to play that role of a mentor. It could mean that maybe it's the neighbor, it could mean it's abomalume, the mother's brothers, it could mean the church structures or whatever is the societal structures that that family is surrounded by. I think the important thing is to then be able to identify who can play this role in the absence of a father and be intentional about making sure that the boys are then exposed to what are those role models. Obviously, there's always a risk that a person that you see as a potential role model is actually something else. But then the diligence and the vigilance around being aware of what's happening with them, creating an open relationship with your sons so that they are able to tell you absolutely anything and not fear what your reaction would be, even if it could be something really horrendous that they're sharing with you as a parent.
Such an important conversation. Thanks so much for your time this morning, Dr. Linda Ncube-Nkomo, the Chief Executive Officer at the new LoveLife Trust.